Wage theft is, broadly is a failure to pay workers the full wages to which they are legally entitled. Wage theft can take many forms, including but not limited to minimum wage violations, which is paying workers less than a minimum wage. This can happen in overt ways where you just pay someone less than a minimum wage, but oftentimes it happens because someone's on a salary, like a manager at a fast food restaurant, and they end up working 60 hours a week and it drops their hourly wage to below minimum wage, right? You cannot, and this is something that's true kind of across a lot of these, issues that we'll talk about tonight. You can't sign away these rights, right? You can't sign a contract that says, you'll be away, you'll work for nothing, that you'll work for below minimum wage. And the minimum wage violations are, the largest percentage of all of this, of wage theft. And it happens, and we're talking about, the workers that are the most oppressed, right? The workers that are the most exploited. And they often don't know their rights. And if they do know their rights, they don't know how to, stand up for them, how to advocate for themselves, how to seek redress from different places. And that means and they're also often in a situation where they need the job, right? They would very much like to file a complaint, and even though retaliation is legal, much like wage theft, it's not very well enforced. So oftentimes, even if they know their rights and they know what they need to do, they don't, because they can't afford to lose the job. They can't afford to be fired. They need to, put food on the table, a house over their heads, and take care of their families. Overtime violations are failing to pay non-exempt employees time and a half hours for hours worked in excess of 40 hours a week. There is some, some states do it by week, some states do it by day. There's some little variation in how overtime is calculated. But across the board, there are a lot of employees that are called exempt, which means that they're a salaried employee that doesn't get overtime, who actually should be categorized, as non-exempt, and thus getting overtime. Off the clock violations, with asking employees to work off the clock or before their shift. It's super common in retail and even in office buildings that people are expected to clock out and continue working, right? We close at 9, but you can't leave till you're done cleaning. That's illegal. If you're doing work that's required by the business, that's mandatory, you must be paid. And in 2022, federal courts even extended this officially to even the booting on of your computer, which is one that I see a lot. I see a lot of times people will be told, you're not pressing power at 8 when you clock in. You need to be logged in and ready to start working at 8, and that's illegal. You have to be paid for the time you press power on your computer while it boots up, right? So I work for a state agency, and I have a crappy standard hard drive laptop, and from when I push power to be between when I can do things is usually 10 to 15 minutes, but I must be paid for that time. If the business wants me to be able to start work at 8, the business either needs to pay me to come in at quarter till, or they need to get a computer with a solid state hard drive that can boot up in less than a minute, and then we can get going, right? But if you're doing work, if it's mandated by your bosses, and Amazon just paid out a huge amount of money to workers for making them be off the clock and wait in line to get their bags checked to make sure that they weren't stealing anything from the warehouses. And they just paid out millions and millions of dollars in a settlement with workers over that, right? So if your boss says you have to do it, you're paid, period, end of story, no negotiations on that. Meal break violations, again, in my time in the service industry and in retail, super common, right? That you just don't have, you're short staffed and you don't get to take a lunch. You don't get to take your allotted breaks. And that's another case of wage theft, right? If your work day is is paid with a half an hour, and this happens all the time. They'll say, don't take your lunch, but we're still taking the half hour from you. Again, wage theft, pay stub and illegal deductions, right? Taking more money than they should, messing with the kind of withholdings and that kind of stuff. Tipped minimum wage violations is another huge one in the food industry. You cannot confiscate tips from your worker. If a worker works a slow shift and does not hit minimum wage, they must be paid up to that minimum wage, right? Because tipped workers are often receiving $2 something an hour. If nobody comes in and nobody tips them, then the business has to pay them an hourly wage that gets them up to that rate. One area where this, where tipped wage violations come in is a lot of management cannot take your tips. Management shouldn't be getting paid out in tips. And that's something that happens in a lot of food service industries where, I've worked places where basically anything that someone put in our tip jar, the owner expected us to put in the till. And that is illegal. That's something that they're not allowed to do. It's stealing the wages and the earned tips of the workers. Another big one is employee misclassification violations, and we'll get into this in a little more in a minute. But it's about misclassifying employees as independent contractors, which allows employers to generally pay lower wages